The sands of Egypt hide more than tombs and treasures. Beneath the stone silence of ancient temples, behind the eyes of statues still staring after 3,000 years, lies a forgotten truth, one the history books rarely whisper. The ancient Egyptians didn't just worship their gods. They experienced them, not in prayer, not in poetry, but through ritual intoxication, through sacred smoke, flower-laced wine, and trance-inducing ceremonies that blurred the line between the human and the divine. In a world ruled by death, order, and eternity, they got high, and not accidentally. This was deliberate, engineered, a spiritual science. Tonight, we begin that journey. Not through myths or legends, but through the ancient pharmacology still echoing in stone walls and sacred scrolls. This is not a story of chaos. It's a story of control, of a civilization that used chemistry not to escape life, but to get closer to the afterlife. Let's begin with the flower that opened the gates to the gods. The blue lotus. In nearly every noble tomb, in the hands of statues and gods, and painted in meticulous color on the walls of sacred temples, the blue lotus appears again and again, its petals curved like flames. Its scent, once said to induce euphoria. And to the Egyptians, it wasn't just a beautiful plant. It was a bridge to the divine. Nymphea caerulea, the sacred blue lotus, wasn't simply admired for its beauty. It was revered for its psychoactive properties. Modern science confirms what the priests and pharaohs knew millennia ago. This lotus contains a porphine, a natural compound that affects dopamine receptors, inducing a state of mild euphoria and dreamlike calm. But it wasn't smoked, snorted, or swallowed. It was soaked in wine. At sacred feasts and royal banquets, wine was infused with blue lotus petals and sipped slowly over the course of long nights filled with music, incense, and ritual performance. It didn't knock the drinker unconscious. It gently lifted the veil. The senses softened, thoughts slowed, and a strange clarity emerged. This wasn't escape. It was elevation. To the Egyptians, intoxication wasn't sin. It was sacred. That's what the blue lotus represented: rebirth, serenity, and divine access. It was linked with Ra, the sun god who rose each day from the petals of a great cosmic lotus. The flower itself, blooming every morning and retreating each night, became a symbol of resurrection. In tombs, mummies were laid to rest with garlands of dried lotus flowers. In temple art, gods offered it to pharaohs as blessings. And at ceremonial gatherings, high priests and priestesses would consume it not to forget the world, but to enter a better one. And nowhere was this practiced more intensely than in the Feast of Drunkenness. It sounds like debauchery. In truth, it was one of the most sacred and structured festivals in the Egyptian religious calendar. The myth behind it is strange and revealing. According to the ancient tale, humanity had sinned against the gods. Ra, the father of creation, was furious. He sent Hathor, the goddess of love and fertility, down in her destructive form. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of vengeance. Her fury was unmatched. She began slaughtering mankind without mercy. The gods panicked. To stop her, they devised a plan. They filled the fields with beer dyed red with pomegranate juice, so that it looked like blood. Sekhmet drank deeply, thinking it was her victims. She grew dizzy, then drowsy, then peaceful. Her rage vanished, and she was transformed back into the gentle Hathor. Each year the Egyptians reenacted this salvation with a massive ritual, the Feast of Drunkenness. But they didn't drink for pleasure. They drank to enter trance. to reach the threshold between mortal and divine. It was intoxication as resurrection, a communal rebirth. The celebrations often began in the early morning, just before sunrise. Music echoed from the temple courtyards. Women danced with polished copper mirrors to reflect the light of Ra. Hymns filled the air. And the beer, sometimes infused with blue lotus, sometimes stronger things, flowed endlessly. Priests and priestesses, commoners and nobles, all drank together. As the day progressed, their laughter turned to chants, their footsteps to rhythm, and their minds, some say, left the body. To reach the gods, the Egyptians believed, you had to lose yourself. And beer, oddly enough, was the vehicle. Unlike modern beer, theirs was thick, more like a fermented barley smoothie. It was nutritious, often consumed with a straw to avoid the solid remains. But this wasn't just food. It was currency. It was offering. It was spiritual fuel. Builders of the pyramids were paid in beer. Children drank it daily. And when blessed by the temple priests, it became divine. The yeast and grain carried not just sustenance, but spirit. And when it was mixed with psychoactive herbs, it could become a doorway, a glass of beer at dawn, a flower dipped in wine, music rising like the sun. And slowly, as the heat and the rhythm and the intoxication set in, the Egyptians believed the veil lifted, and the gods stepped through. But the most potent and mysterious substance wasn't swallowed or drunk. It was burned. Kai-fi, a sacred incense of staggering complexity. Kai-fi was Egypt's olfactory prayer. It was made from a dozen or more ingredients: myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, juniper, raisins, honey, wine, each ground and aged for days or even weeks. The process was ritualized, the formula guarded. The purpose, transcendence. When burned in temple sanctuaries, Kai-fi filled the air with a dense, sweet smoke. And in those dim chambers of stone, where light barely touched the walls, it created an atmosphere unlike anything else in the ancient world. You didn't walk into a temple, you entered a dream. Modern analysis suggests Kai-fi may have mild psychoactive properties, sedative, hypnotic, possibly even hallucinogenic. When combined with chanting, dim lighting, echoing architecture, and the power of belief, the experience could be overwhelming. And this was the point. In the Egyptian worldview, the body was not an obstacle to spiritual truth. It was a vessel. The senses were gifts, to be used, trained, and even manipulated for divine contact. Sound, scent, taste, touch, all were paths to the gods. And so they used them. The blue lotus for clarity and peace, beer for connection and communion, Kai-fi for transformation. Together, they formed a sacred pharmacology, a map to the divine written not in ink, but in chemistry. The high priests understood this. They weren't just spiritual leaders. They were ritual technicians, pharmacologists, alchemists. And in their hands, intoxication wasn't a vice. It was a tool, a weapon against chaos, a way to glimpse eternity. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because while the blue lotus soothed the mind and Kai-fi softened the soul, darker, more dangerous plants waited in the shadows of the temple apothecary. Plants that didn't calm, but shattered. That didn't elevate, but pulled you down into the underworld. Poppy, mandrake, cannabis. The priests knew their power. The gods demanded their use. In part 2, we enter this more secret world, where drugs weren't just sacred, they were forbidden. Not all substances in ancient Egypt were celebrated with song and dance. Some were locked away, whispered about in temple corridors, guarded by hieroglyphs that hinted, but never named, hidden in jars beneath the sands. not for feasts, not for festivals, but for rituals so powerful. They bordered on the forbidden. We ended part one with the sacred. Blue lotus, kefe, beer, incense. Now we descend into the shadowed apothecary of the high priesthood, where plants weren't meant to soothe the soul, but open it, forcefully, violently. Where gods weren't invited, they were summoned. The first of these, the opium poppy. Modern medicine knows its name well. Papaver somniferum, source of morphine, codeine, heroin. But long before pharmacies, it was already in use. In tombs from the 18th dynasty, small ceramic vials shaped like poppy heads have been discovered. Their narrow necks suggest the storage of potent liquids, resins, tinctures, substances not meant for casual use. These weren't cosmetics. They were tools for navigating altered states. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical scroll over 3,500 years old, contains dozens of references to pain-relieving mixtures. Among them, combinations that hint at opium's inclusion. Sedative balms for children, elixirs for surgical procedures, potions for visions. The priests would never call it opium, but they called it sleep. They called it silence. They called it the plant that brings dreams. And dreams, in ancient Egypt, were not private things. They were portals, communication lines between the living and the dead. If blue lotus brought clarity, poppy brought oblivion, the clean break from the waking world that opened the gates of the duat, the underworld. But not all substances made you sleep. Some did the opposite. They shattered reality wide open. Mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, was known across the ancient world. Its roots twisted like human limbs, its scent intoxicating, its chemistry dangerous. The Egyptians called it jadjat, a mysterious word, a word linked to fertility, to ecstasy, to death. We know they used it. Tomb paintings from the New Kingdom show mandrake fruits offered to guests in banquets, often alongside blue lotus, often within wine. But while blue lotus calmed, mandrake agitated. Its active compounds, scopolamine and atropine, are anticholinergic hallucinogens. In higher doses, they induce confusion, disorientation, vivid visions, and even delirium. In lower doses, euphoria, sensory enhancement, sexual stimulation. And that, too, was sacred. Mandrake was not just a drug. It was a symbol of rebirth, of the union between male and female, between earth and spirit. In some magical papyri, it's used in love spells. In others, in curses. It was neither good nor evil. It was power. And in the hands of the priesthood, power was tightly controlled. Ritual manuals from Greco-Egyptian times hint at procedures involving mandrake roots carved into figures, anointed with oils, and burned with incantations under specific lunar phases. These weren't recreational acts. These were operations of ritual magic. And still, one more plant lingered in the temple shadows. A plant familiar to modernity. Cannabis. Its presence in ancient Egypt is debated. But the evidence, while subtle, is mounting. In the Ramesseum medical papyri, a text over 3,700 years old, there's a reference to a remedy involving shemshemet. Some scholars believe this word refers to hemp. It appears in multiple recipes, salves, fumigants, suppositories. It's listed as a treatment for inflammation, for glaucoma-like symptoms, for uterine pain. But this isn't just about healing the body. In certain funerary texts, the deceased is described as ascending in smoke, rising in fragrance. Not metaphorical, literal. In temples, censers burned not just incense, but mixtures. Mixtures that changed, mixtures tailored for specific rituals. And in some of these censers, chemical traces have been found, including cannabinoids. Was cannabis used to enter trance? Possibly. To speak with gods? Perhaps. To become one with Osiris, with Ra, with the divine? The Egyptians never said outright, but their silence was often strategic, because what they feared most, more than death, was chaos, the unmaking of order, which is why only the trained were allowed access to the deeper rituals, to the sacred pharmacology, to the plants that didn't just elevate, but transform. This wasn't for the common people. This was for the priesthood, and beyond them, for the dead. Because if the living used drugs to touch the gods, the dead needed them to become one. Inside certain royal tombs, archaeologists have found caches of herbs, wrapped in linen, placed beside the body, mixed into oils. Some of them, later analysis revealed, included psychoactive species, henbane, mandrake, even potential traces of hashish. Why give drugs to the dead? Because in Egyptian belief, the soul needed tools to navigate the afterlife. The journey through the duat was long, full of demons, trials, transformations, and perhaps, just perhaps, a little help was required. A herb to calm the soul, a root to open the third eye, a flower to guide the spirit. These weren't funerary decorations. They were weapons. The same substances the priests used in temples, they gave to pharaohs in tombs. Ritual pharmacology, taken from the realm of the living into the realm of the dead. This is where Egypt differs from modernity. Today, drugs are seen as escape, a weakness, a vice. But to the Egyptians, they were a science. And this science wasn't hidden in back rooms or behind veils. It was carved into the walls of the most sacred spaces, embedded into hymns, blended into perfumes, whispered into spells. It was encoded into the structure of their civilization. Even the gods weren't immune. Hathor, goddess of intoxication. Thoth, god of wisdom and altered perception. Bes, the dwarf god, protector of the home, bringer of ecstasy and dance. These deities weren't just metaphors. They were embodiments of altered states, divine explanations for psychoactive experience. And this, perhaps, is the greatest secret of all. That ancient Egypt, a civilization defined by death, may have understood life far more deeply than we assume. They embraced altered states not as distractions, but as sacred moments of contact with the divine. Moments when reality bent and truth slipped through. Moments when mortality itself became negotiable. And yet, there's one more aspect we haven't explored. We've seen the festivals, the flowers, the feasts, the forbidden herbs. But beneath all of it, there was a deeper ritual, a process far more intense. Initiation, where altered states weren't just used, they were mastered. Where priests and magicians underwent trance journeys, visions, ego death, and came back changed. In part 3, we'll step into this world of temple initiation, of dream magic, of inner transformation, and discover the sacred ceremonies that transformed mortals into something else entirely. Not quite human, not quite divine, but something in between. There are rooms in ancient Egypt no commoner ever entered. Rooms without windows, sealed in silence. Walls thick with carved symbols, serpents, stars, birds' eyes. Always the eyes. These were the inner sanctums, not places of worship, but theaters of metamorphosis. This is where the sacred was not preached. It was experienced, not in belief, but in vision, To stand in that chamber was to stand between worlds. And to get there, you didn't just walk. You crossed over. The path was long, harsh, ritualistic, a breaking of the self. It began not with a door, but with preparation. Initiates of Egypt's mystery schools, priestly candidates, scribes, or chosen acolytes, underwent a strict regimen: fasting, isolation, rhythmic breathing, darkness, chanting. Sometimes days, sometimes weeks. Their senses dulled to the ordinary world, until even silence grew deafening. Then, under the strict guidance of the priesthood, the substance would be introduced, sometimes inhaled, sometimes consumed, sometimes placed under the tongue or into the body through oils and salves. The purpose was singular: open the gates, not metaphorically, but neurologically, spiritually, to induce the altered state necessary to perform the journey. Across Egypt, this ritual was described in many forms, sometimes as a descent into the underworld, other times as a union with a god, and always as a death, not of the body, of the ego. In one initiation rite described in the Temple of Edfu texts, the initiate is blinded by light, struck down by the gaze of Horus, and resurrected with new eyes. Modern scholars have argued this isn't poetic language. It's psychoactive experience. The intense visual hallucinations, the sense of ego dissolution, the symbolic rebirth into a higher level of spiritual perception. This was not entertainment. This was reprogramming. The temple was the hardware, the ritual, the software, and the mind, the device. But what was the purpose? Why such extreme effort? Because in ancient Egypt, knowledge was dangerous. The secrets of the gods, the true nature of reality, the mechanisms of the afterlife, the power of spoken word and sacred geometry, could not be handed to the unprepared. They had to be earned, lived, and the only way to live them was to die first, symbolically, spiritually, psychologically, to strip away identity, memory, form, and rebuild something stronger. Let's not forget, this was a civilization obsessed with the afterlife. Their entire culture, architecture, language, religion, was built around what happens after death. And to truly understand it, you had to experience a controlled simulation of death, an initiation, where the mind was guided into the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, and forced to confront its demons, real or imagined, guided by symbols, anchored by sound, and fueled by substances that blurred the veil between perception and vision. We know these rituals occurred. In the Temple of Dendera, under Hathor's gaze, there are depictions of healing chambers, dark enclosed rooms where sound, incense, and rhythm were used to induce trance states. Some even featured resonant architecture, chambers designed to vibrate at specific frequencies when hymns were chanted, producing an auditory hallucination effect. And in those states, visions came, gods appearing in fire, serpents coiling around the self, stars raining from the ceiling, time bending, fear melting, identity dissolving, and after, silence, a return, but not as the same person. Those who passed through the rite were no longer ordinary. They were transformed, initiated, now able to read sacred texts, now permitted to handle magical objects, now entrusted with temple rituals that the masses never saw. And in these private ceremonies, the role of mind-altering agents became even more advanced. Psychoactive honey, fermented pomegranate elixirs, Kai-Fi resin laced with secret herbs, lotus wines strengthened with unknown additives. Some scholars believe the Egyptian word for this class of sacred medicine was sa, sometimes written as sekum. Both words relate to power and protection. It wasn't just about intoxication. It was about altered cognition, amplified memory, heightened perception. In the Book of the Dead, spells describe drinking the water of memory, inhaling the breath of the gods, and consuming the sacred flame. Not symbolic. Literal acts performed in controlled rituals. The Egyptian priesthood was not experimenting. They were engineering states of consciousness. Long before psychology, long before neuroscience, they were mapping inner realities with precision through plants, sound, architecture, and ritual timing. And perhaps most impressively, they kept this knowledge hidden for thousands of years. Why? Because the uninitiated could not be trusted. As Plato, who studied in Egypt, later wrote, "The eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend." And that preparation took years, which is why, at the center of these rites, always stood the same symbol, the Eye of Horus, not just a protective charm, but a map, a stylized depiction of the human brain, the pineal gland, the corpus callosum, the thalamus, an ancient anatomical metaphor for awakening the inner sight, the eye that sees the unseen. And when it opened, the initiate saw everything. In modern terms, this might be called a psychedelic awakening, a neurological rebirth, a mystical experience. But in ancient Egypt, it was simply called knowledge. But that knowledge came at a cost. Not all returned whole. Some initiates broke, were never the same. In papyri, like the Leiden papyrus and the Demotic magical papyrus, there are references to those who remained behind, lost in trance. Fragmented, Madam the gods could be generous. But they could also be cruel. That's why these rites were only for the few, the chosen, the trained, and always the prepared. In the modern world, we seek altered states for escape. But the Egyptians sought them for understanding, to know themselves, to know the gods, to know the thin, sharp line between life and death, and walk it, eyes open. In Part 4, we'll explore how this sacred knowledge wasn't just used in temples, but embedded into statecraft. How pharaohs used ritual intoxication not just for spiritual power, but for political control, and how entire festivals became state-sponsored hallucinations to keep the empire in order, because when the gods speak through wine and smoke, even empires must listen. It's easy to imagine ancient Egypt as quiet, dusty, reverent. But once a year, sometimes more, the silence broke, the temples opened, the gods came out, and the people lost themselves. Not in chaos, not in rebellion, but in ritual. Controlled, rehearsed, and yet completely intoxicating. These were the Egyptian festivals, the great public rites. Thousands gathered, music roared, wine flowed like the Nile. And at the center of it all, the gods, paraded through the streets in sacred barks, veiled by incense, flanked by dancing priestesses and pounding drums. But this was not celebration for its own sake. This was state-sponsored transformation. The best known was the Feast of Opet, a grand days-long ritual where the statue of Amun, god of kingship and creation, traveled from Karnak to Luxor. He moved not alone, but alongside the pharaoh, symbolically merging, one as divine, one as ruler. And by the end of the procession, they were indistinguishable. To the people, this was awe-inspiring. But beneath the awe was intoxication. Every major festival included wine, lotuses, incense, all psychoactive, not randomly, strategically. In the festival of drunkenness, the story went that humanity once angered the gods. Hathor, in lioness form, was sent to destroy them. But before she could finish, Ra tricked her, giving her red beer dyed to look like blood. She drank, slept, forgot her wrath, and humanity survived. The ritual reenactment of this myth involved mass drinking, music, trance dance, sometimes sexual activity, always altered states. And while it seemed wild, it was deeply coded. The chaos had a purpose. It broke routine, eroded hierarchy, just enough, and then the priests rebuilt it. The experience wasn't an escape. It was a reset. Anthropologists now believe that these festivals served multiple functions: spiritual access, to open temporary communion with the gods; social cohesion, to dissolve class tensions and controlled chaos; political reinforcement, to remind the people that the gods and the pharaoh still reigned; and above all, to control belief. Because when thousands share a vision, even if it's induced, it becomes reality. Let's not forget, Egypt's empire spanned millennia, and in a land without elections, propaganda didn't come through pamphlets. It came through ritual spectacle, and the most powerful spectacles were not just seen or heard, they were felt, deep in the mind. Let's return to the Blue Lotus. During festivals, it wasn't simply decoration. It was wine additive, chewed, worn, offered. It calmed the nerves, opened perception, made the heart light, as inscriptions say. But other, darker substances were used as well. In some temple inventories, we find references to Shem Shemet, a now lost herb scholars suspect may have contained datura alkaloids, known to induce hallucinations, amnesia, and ego dissolution in even small doses. These were used not for joy, but for control. In certain royal ceremonies, such herbs were administered to oracles and dream interpreters. The goal: induce visions, and then interpret them, always through the lens of priestly power. Imagine being one of thousands in a crowd, watching the god statue glide down the avenue. You're already disoriented, fasting for days, the incense thick, the chants reverberating in your skull. You drink the wine. You smell the resins. You chew the petal. You begin to feel something, not just emotionally, physically. Your body warm, your thoughts bending. The statue suddenly doesn't feel like stone anymore. It's moving, looking, speaking. And then the oracle begins to shout. The god is pleased. The pharaoh is blessed. Egypt will flourish. The crowd erupts. But what you don't know is, the ritual was crafted for this moment. Every element, the rhythm, the architecture, the smoke, the scent, the substance, choreographed. The state didn't just rule by force, it ruled by experience. And the experience was real, because the brain, under the right influence, cannot tell the difference between vision and reality. This is what Egypt perfected. While other ancient cultures feared intoxication or used it privately, Egypt weaponized it to deepen faith, to unify identity, to renew the social contract, not through writing, but through ritualized hallucination. And yet, it wasn't all manipulation. To the Egyptians, these experiences were gifts. They truly believed the gods were present, that trance and intoxication weren't illusions, but revelations. The line between genuine mysticism and political strategy was thin, and perhaps even irrelevant. Because in Egypt, perception was truth. And so, while the priests maintained control, the people truly felt the gods. That's why they kept coming back, year after year, festival after festival, even in times of famine, even when the Nile failed. They came to see the statues, but they stayed for what they felt inside. And when the rite ended, When the god returned to the temple, when the drums stopped, when the petals wilted, life resumed. But with something changed. The memory of connection, even if chemically induced. The belief that the divine had touched them. And belief, as every ruler knows, is the most powerful control of all. By the time Egypt entered its late dynastic period, some of these rites grew even more theatrical. New substances entered circulation. Trade brought foreign herbs, resins, and elixirs. Greek observers were astonished. Herodotus called Egypt a land of endless wonders. But what he didn't see, or chose not to write, was what those wonders did to the mind. Even as outside powers rose, Persia, then Greece, then Rome, the Egyptian ritual system endured. Festivals still happened, temples still pulsed with incense, and initiates still vanished into darkness to meet the gods. Even Cleopatra, the last true pharaoh, carried on the tradition. It said her palace was thick with scented air, perfumes infused with lotus, wine with unknown herbs, rooms designed for divine dreaming. Perhaps she understood, better than her Roman lovers, that true power wasn't held in swords or treaties, but in what people believed, in what they saw and felt and dreamed, even if those dreams came from a cup of laced wine. In Part 5, we journey into the final mystery. What happened to this knowledge? Where did it go? And why, for thousands of years, did no one speak of it? Until now. By the time Cleopatra lay dying in her palace, wrapped in silk, poison on her lips, the world that had sustained Egypt for over 3,000 years was crumbling. The priests still lit their censers. The sacred perfume still burned. But the power behind the rites, the control, the trance, spiritual engineering, was fading. And soon, it disappeared, not by accident, but by erasure. When Rome absorbed Egypt, it did more than conquer land. It began a systematic dismantling of belief. The temples were stripped of their autonomy, the festivals restricted, the oracles silenced, and with them, the secrets of ritual intoxication vanished. It wasn't just spiritual, it was political. The Roman worldview, though deeply religious, feared chaos. It valued order, law, structure. The Egyptian practice of induced vision, of sacred madness, was foreign, dangerous. So they buried it, quite literally. Temple records burned, priests executed or exiled, ritual formulas, written in scrolls and painted on walls, were deemed heresy. By the time Christianity swept through Egypt in the 4th century, the ancient temples were abandoned, the hieroglyphs forgotten, and the last of the flower-bearing priestesses disappeared into myth. And for 1,500 years, no one could read what was left behind. The walls still whispered, but no one could hear. No one, until a stone slab was pulled from the sand in 1799. The Rosetta Stone. And with it, the long-dead language of Egypt began to breathe again. But even then, even after we could read the words, the truth remained hidden. Because modern scholars, bound by Enlightenment rationality, could not believe what they were reading. They saw references to dreaming rooms, God-infused wines, talking statues, and assumed it was metaphor. They read about the blue lotus and assumed it was decorative. They saw instructions for trance rituals and dismissed them as symbolic. It took another 200 years and the rise of modern ethnobotany, psychopharmacology, and neuroscience to realize what had been staring us in the face. Ancient Egypt had mapped the human mind, and not through philosophy, through ritual pharmacology. They didn't just stumble into altered states, they engineered them, They blended herbs, not at random, but with precision. They built architecture not just for grandeur, but for acoustic resonance. They used incense to stimulate the limbic system, rhythmic drumming to synchronize brain waves, darkness and light to manipulate serotonin and melatonin production. In short, they built temples like brains and walked people into deliberate, mystic states. And what makes this revelation even more haunting is that we almost never knew. It was nearly lost, entirely, because for millennia, no one asked the right question. We asked what the Egyptians built. We asked who they worshipped. But we never asked, what did they feel? We never looked at the flower in the hand of a goddess and wondered, what did this do to the body? We never read the opening of the mouth ritual and thought, was this sensory activation? We never considered that when a priest said he saw the god enter the statue. He meant it, that he was high. And in that altered state, he did see something, not fake, not delusional, real, to him, as real as you reading these words. Modern science now confirms that in states of trance, the brain activates non-ordinary perception, hallucinations, visions, revelations, all biologically explainable, yet still deeply meaningful. That was the Egyptian genius. They didn't fear this. They mastered it and used it, not to lose control, but to keep it. They ruled not just by sword, but by vision. They didn't force you to believe. They made you feel belief. And once you feel something, it becomes your truth. But this story doesn't end in the past. Because today, the sands are shifting again. Across the world, researchers are revisiting ancient texts, uncovering old formulas, cross-referencing modern pharmacology with sacred scrolls. Archaeologists are finding residue on temple bowls. Botanists are identifying psychoactive compounds in Egyptian perfumes. Neuroscientists are studying how these ancient rites may have shaped collective consciousness. We are, in a way, opening the tombs again. But this time, not for treasure, for understanding. Because the deeper we look, the more we see that Egypt wasn't primitive. It wasn't obsessed with death, it was obsessed with experience, with the mystery of perception, with the riddle of what lies behind the veil of waking life. And that's what makes this story not just history, but prophecy. Because in our age, an age of disconnection, algorithm, and noise, we are returning to the question the Egyptians asked 4,000 years ago. How can the mind touch the divine? They answered with flowers, resins, rhythm, and wine. They built experiences so powerful, they shaped empires. And though time tried to silence them, though their temples crumbled and their gods faded, the echoes remain, in the scent of a blue lotus, in the flicker of a candle in a dark room, in the drumbeat of trance that still lives in our DNA. The ancient Egyptians didn't get high just to escape. They got high to remember, to touch something eternal. And maybe, just maybe, so can we. If we listen closely enough, if we read between the lines, and if we remember that sometimes the greatest truths are not found in the light, but in the vision that comes in the dark,